I knew a girl who never took off her wedding dress. Weeks turned into months.
I knew a girl who never took off her wedding dress. Not the day after, not the week after, not even as the months bled into seasons and the lace turned gray from rain. She wore it as if peeling it away would undo the vow itself, as if cloth could keep a promise stitched tighter than words ever could. Her name was Polen, and she grew up across the street from me. I never thought her life would turn into a story people whispered about in kitchens and on porches when they thought the grieving couldn't hear. But I saw it unfold, day after day, and I can tell you that none of us were prepared for how long she would keep living in that dress, or what seemed to start living in it with her. Polen had always seemed like the kind of person who belonged to the world of routine. She studied hard, she came home on weekends to help her parents with errands, she waved politely to neighbors, and she never got tangled in the messes the rest of us made. My memories of her are filled with small things, the way she pushed my bike when I was a kid, the way she watered plants for my mother when we were out of town, the way she sometimes stood on the curb at night staring at the river, as if she was waiting for something. She wasn't mysterious to us then, just a quiet girl who seemed more grown up than the rest of us. I thought I knew her. I didn't. I met Aiden when I was 20, and she brought him to one of those neighborhood barbecues that always happen around the 4th of July. He had the kind of presence that made other men want to stand straighter. Broad shoulders, sunburned nose, hair that curled at the ends because he hadn't gotten around to cutting it. He laughed easily, carried heavy things without being asked, and never seemed embarrassed by anything. You could tell from the way Polen looked at him that she believed she had found the one thing she'd never lose. It's easy to believe in permanence when you're young. We all did. Their engagement wasn't a surprise. Polen's mother was glowing the day the ring appeared, as if she'd known all along. The neighbors joined in as though it were a shared accomplishment. Pies, small gifts, and advice from women who still wore rings themselves. Even I got pulled into the preparation. I strung lights across fences, I moved tables, I listened to a dozen debates about flowers. It felt like something good was finally happening in our quiet town, like we'd all get to live through it with them. None of us wanted to admit that good things rarely last here. I remember the first time Polen mentioned vows in a way that made me uneasy. We were standing in her parents' yard, testing the bulbs on the light strings. She said people treat vows like weather, something that changes with mood. But to her, a vow was a chain. You don't just speak it, you put it on like skin. And if it tears, you tear with it. I laughed awkwardly because what else do you do when someone talks like that over tangled wires and half-burnt bulbs? I told myself she was nervous about the wedding, and I let it go. Later, that sentence would come back to me like something etched on stone. The dress itself was a story. She found it in a shop 2 towns away, secondhand, tucked between stiff taffeta nightmares and overpriced satin. It was simple, cream-colored instead of bright white, with a line of small buttons running all the way down the back. No sequins, no frills, no designer label. When she wore it at her fitting, her mother cried. I thought it looked too plain, but on her it seemed inevitable, like the dress had been waiting. I can still see the way her fingers trailed along those buttons when no one else was watching, as if she was learning them by touch. But her voice pulled me in. Please, I don't want to be alone anymore.
The rehearsal night was rain-soaked. The church basement smelled of wet coats and brewed coffee. The kids ran circles around tables while adults fussed over candles. I sat in the back with a cup of weak punch, watching Polen and Aiden run through the steps. He slowed down without looking when she stumbled, and she tightened her grip on his sleeve for half a second longer than necessary. They looked like people rehearsing for something more than one day. Everyone said rain on a wedding was luck. Her mother muttered that luck is just what you call it when disaster hasn't arrived yet, then laughed it off too loudly. People hear omens everywhere if you let them. The night before, I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, as if the river itself was pressing against the town. Around 2 a.m, I walked to my porch for air. Across the street, their living room light was still on. Through the window, I saw the dress hanging from the closet door frame, its shape glowing faintly in the yellow light. Poland walked into the room, stood in front of it, and touched the row of buttons with both hands. She stayed like that for what felt like minutes, her face unreadable, her body still. Then she turned the light off, and the window went dark. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just a girl waiting for her big day. But part of me shivered, and not from the night air. The day itself was clear, the rain swept out by wind. The church stood bright in the morning sun, its peeling paint disguised by ribbons and flowers. The neighbors filled pews in their best clothes. Children whined, fathers sweated in stiff collars, mothers whispered corrections and fussed over hair. The organist fumbled a few notes during practice, but assured everyone he'd be fine when it counted. The air inside buzzed with that strange tension weddings carry, part celebration, part dread, because everyone knows this is a gamble disguised as ceremony. I was standing near the front when the doors opened and she appeared. Poland on her father's arm, the dress fitted to her like it had been stitched from her own skin. The row of buttons glinted under the light. For a moment, everyone inhaled at once, the silence heavy as a stone. Then the music swelled, and she walked down the aisle. People smiled. Phones flashed. Aiden's face broke into that easy grin that always seemed too wide for the world. It should have ended in laughter and clinking glasses and speeches that rambled too long, in dancing under strings of lights until shoes were kicked off. It should have been ordinary. But as I watched her reach the altar, I caught the way her lips moved before the vows began. She whispered something to herself, words too soft for anyone else to hear. Her eyes weren't on Aiden, they were on the dress itself, as if the fabric had become a second witness. And in that moment, before the tragedy, before the sirens and the shattered glass and the whispers that followed, I felt something heavy in the air. Something I couldn't name then, but that I know now. She was already binding herself to more than a man. You found me. Now let me in.
The reception never happened. People still argue about the order of events, as if sorting the minutes into neat lines could keep them from twisting the way they did. What I know is this. They left the church just before dusk, her dress trailing down the steps like light poured into fabric. Rice was thrown, cameras flashed, laughter spilled onto the street. Aiden opened the car door for her, the kind of small gesture that made older women smile and whisper, "See, he'll be a good husband." She ducked into the seat, careful of the lace, and he circled to the driver's side. The engine coughed, headlights swept across the crowd, and then they were gone. Minutes later, so was he. The crash happened 2 miles from town, at the intersection where the highway cuts through the trees. A semi ran a light, brakes screaming too late. Witnesses said it was over in seconds. Metal against metal, glass exploding, a silence heavier than sound. Aiden was killed instantly. Pollen was pulled from the wreckage by strangers who didn't know her name, her dress streaked with blood and oil, her veil tangled in the doorframe. I wasn't there. I only heard the sirens, felt the air shift, watched neighbors run toward the sound. By the time I reached the hospital, she was alive, sitting on a gurney, wrapped in a blanket, staring down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The rest was a blur of statements and condolences. The reception hall was canceled. Flowers withered in buckets. Food went uneaten. People tried to comfort her, but grief made her untouchable. At the funeral for Aiden, she wore the dress again, freshly cleaned, veil pinned back into her hair. Some said it was strength, others said it was madness, but no one told her to change. She stood by the casket with eyes fixed straight ahead, lips unmoving, body rigid as stone. The photographer who'd been hired for the wedding came anyway and took a picture of her standing alone in that dress beside the coffin. Later, the image floated around town like a curse no one wanted to look at directly. Days passed, then weeks. People assumed she would eventually fold the dress into a box, place it in a closet, and let the world resume. Instead, she wore it every day. To the store, to the doctor, sitting on her parents' porch with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the street as if waiting for a car that would never arrive. At first, neighbors whispered that maybe she just couldn't bear to part with it yet, that grief had its own timetable. But when September came and the hymn dragged leaves across the pavement, when the sleeves yellowed with sweat and sun, the whispers grew louder. I saw her often because I couldn't not. Our windows faced each other across the narrow street. At night, I'd catch her standing in her room, lit by the lamp, still in that dress, brushing her hair methodically as if preparing for another ceremony. Once, unable to stop myself, I crossed over with some excuse about borrowing a ladder. Her mother let me in, relief flickering across her face, as if hoping I could say something to break the spell. Pollen sat in the living room, dress buttoned to her throat, hands clasped on her knees. I asked softly how she was. She looked at me, not with sadness, not even anger, but with a calmness that chilled me. She said, "I made a vow. I'll keep it until he comes back."
People tried to rationalize. Maybe she had trauma. Maybe she was punishing herself. Maybe the dress was the only thing anchoring her. Therapists came and went. Pills were prescribed and left untouched on the counter. Her mother begged. Her father raged. Nothing moved her. She washed the dress every Sunday, hanging it carefully in the yard, lace fluttering like a ghost on the line. Children passing on bicycles shrieked and said it looked alive. The stains never fully left. There were faint smudges on the fabric, like shadows that clung no matter how hot the water ran. By October, the dress no longer looked bridal. It looked like a relic. The buttons pulled loose, threads frayed, but she wore it as though it were armor. She stopped answering greetings on the street. Sometimes I'd glance across at night and see her standing by the closet again, running her fingers along the line of buttons, whispering under her breath. Once I swore I saw the dress move before she did, a ripple down the fabric, like breath passing beneath it. I blinked, and it was gone. Halloween came. Children avoided the house. Parents said it was because of the sad lady, but I think the children knew more. They said they heard someone crying in the upstairs window when no one was there. They said they saw a man's shadow standing behind her, even when she was alone. I didn't believe them. I told myself grief creates echoes. But I stopped opening my blinds at night. November brought frost. Pollen still walked the street in that dress, shoes crunching against frozen leaves, hem dragging wet across icy pavement. Once I saw her kneel in the middle of the road at dawn, hands pressed to the ground, as if listening. A car honked, swerved around her, and she didn't flinch. Later that day, her father boarded up the upstairs windows, claiming drafts. But everyone knew it was because neighbors kept catching sight of her standing there, staring down in silence,
dress glowing pale in the dim light. I tried to intervene again. I crossed the street and knocked. Her mother answered, eyes red, face hollow. She said Pauline was upstairs. Against better judgment, I climbed. The door was half open. She was inside, sitting on the bed, dress spread around her like spilled milk. She was sewing, not repairing seams, not patching tears, but stitching something new into the fabric. Words, shapes, symbols I didn't recognize, letters that curved wrong, lines that crossed where they shouldn't. She looked up, needle paused midair, and said in a voice that didn't tremble, "He'll need a way to find me." I backed out before I could ask what she meant. Her mother closed the door quietly behind me, like someone shutting out a storm. By winter, the dress had hardened with cold, stiff fabric crunching when she moved, yet she still wore it. Still refused coats or scarves. Snow clung to the hem, ice crusted the lace, but she didn't shiver. The neighbors stopped speaking of her except in low tones. Some crossed the street rather than walk past her porch. Once late at night, I saw her outside in the snow barefoot, dress glowing under the street lamp. She stood with her head tilted back, mouth open catching snowflakes. The flakes melted on her lips and rolled down her chin like tears she couldn't shed.
The strangest thing happened just before Christmas. Lights went up on the houses, wreaths on doors, the usual rituals. One evening, Pauline stood in her yard, dress trailing across dead grass, staring at the house across the way. She raised her hand and waved. I followed her gaze. No one was there. Only an empty window reflecting the sky. She smiled faintly, like someone had waved back, and whispered, "See you soon." Then she turned and walked inside. That night, I dreamt of her wedding. Not the one we witnessed, but another. A dark church, pews filled with shadows, Pauline walking down the aisle in her ruined dress. At the altar stood a figure I couldn't see clearly. Tall and faceless, hands stretched out. She took those hands and whispered her vows again. When I woke, my throat was raw, as if I had been the one speaking. Across the street, her lamp still glowed. The dress hung in the window, like a body suspended. I tried not to think about omens, but it was impossible. Everything about her, about the dress, about the air around that house felt like a countdown, as if we were all waiting for something to arrive, something she had already promised herself to. And by then, I wasn't sure if she was wearing the dress anymore, or if the dress was wearing her.
By January, the street had gone silent. No more neighbors bringing soup to her parents' door. No more quiet gestures of kindness disguised as errands. People stopped pretending that Pauline would come out of this the way other widows eventually did, with time and therapy and the slow trickle of new days. Instead, they walked faster past the house, children pulled by the hand, voices lowered to a hush as if sound itself might offend whatever lived inside those walls. I didn't blame them. Even from across the street, I felt the air shift whenever she moved past the window in that dress, like the fabric itself carried static, humming faintly with a presence that didn't belong to the living. I kept telling myself that grief does strange things, that I was reading too much into what I saw. But each week made denial harder. Once, walking home late, I noticed her standing at the end of her driveway under the street lamp. Snow swirled, wind cut sharp, but she didn't move. The dress clung to her body stiff as paper, lace frozen at the edges. I thought she was looking at me until I realized her head was tilted, eyes fixed on the ground at her feet, lips moving soundlessly. I slowed, afraid she might collapse. Then, as I took another step, She crouched suddenly and pressed her palms to the pavement like she was feeling for heat in the frozen asphalt. She stayed like that until I backed away, too unsettled to watch longer. Later, when I lay awake replaying it, I wondered if she was listening, and if so, to what. Her mother stopped opening the curtains. When I asked politely if they needed anything, she forced a smile and said everything was fine, but I saw the way her hands trembled as she fidgeted with her sleeves. The house looked darker now, blinds drawn, porch light off. Only Pauline's window burned late into the night, the pale square of light cutting across the street like an accusation. Sometimes I'd wake at 3 a.m. and see her silhouette there, the outline of the dress unmistakable even in shadows. And once, God help me, once I saw another silhouette behind her, taller, thinner, its hand resting on her shoulder. When I blinked, it was gone, and she was alone again, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. The dress itself began to change. At first, it was only subtle. The fabric yellowing in strange patches, the buttons dulling as if touched by salt water. But then, the seams started to lengthen. I noticed this when she stood on the porch one evening as her father shoveled snow. The hem trailed farther than before, dragging 2-3 feet behind her, though I remembered clearly it had once stopped neatly at her ankles. The fabric rippled even when the wind was still. Neighbors whispered that the dress was growing, stretching like ivy across stone. I laughed at the idea when I heard it, but I couldn't laugh at what my own eyes told me. The dress wasn't staying the same. It was evolving.
By February, I stopped counting the days since the wedding. They blurred into one another, marked only by strange new details. Sometimes, passing her on the street, I smelled earth, damp and heavy, clinging to the lace, as if she'd been kneeling in a field freshly turned. Other times, I swore I saw stains blooming on the fabric, dark as bruises, only to fade when I blinked. She didn't acknowledge me anymore, not even with a nod. She moved like someone underwater, each gesture deliberate, each step slower than necessary, her eyes always somewhere else. The kids who once rode their bikes up and down our block began daring each other to approach her yard. They never made it far. One evening, I watched from my porch as a pair of brothers crept onto her driveway, whispering loud enough for me to catch the words, "Ghost Bride." Pauline appeared in the doorway without a sound, framed in shadow, the dress hanging off her shoulders like a shroud. The boys froze. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched them with a calm that looked older than she was. After a long silence, the younger one burst into tears. The older pulled him away, their sneakers squeaking on the pavement. The next day, both families moved their bikes to the back alleys. No children came down our street again. I started dreaming of the dress. At first, harmless things, the fabric swaying on a clothesline, the buttons clinking faintly as if tapped by unseen hands. But then the dreams grew heavier. I saw Pauline in the church again, walking down the aisle in the ruined dress, except this time the pews weren't filled with people. They were filled with shadows, shifting, restless, leaning forward to watch her pass. At the altar stood Aidan, or what was left of him, his face blurred, jaw unhinged, skin stretched too tight across bone. When she reached him, she turned to look at me, and her smile was wide enough to tear her cheeks. I always woke before the kiss, my sheets damp with sweat, my throat raw from screaming silently into the pillow. I told myself these were dreams, nothing more, but dreams started seeping into daylight. One morning, walking to my car, I found something caught on my windshield wiper, a strip of lace, frayed at the edges, faintly stained. My stomach turned cold. I glanced across the street. Pauline was on her porch, dress intact, watching me with unreadable eyes. I peeled the lace from the glass and shoved it into my pocket, too afraid to ask if it belonged to her. That night, when I checked, it was gone. The pocket empty. No trace. I didn't sleep at all after that. Her father grew sick. Stress, people said, though no doctor could name it. He thinned, coughed, stopped appearing outside. Her mother aged in weeks, what should have taken years. Meanwhile, Pauline seemed untouched. Pale, yes, but not ill. The dress remained her second skin. Sometimes I wondered if she was still even beneath it. Sometimes I thought the fabric itself had eaten her alive, wearing her like a puppet. The thought terrified me. What terrified me more was that part of me believed she wanted it that way.
The house began to sound different at night. Even from across the street, I heard things, muffled knocks, slow, dragging noises, faint humming that didn't match any melody I knew. Once on a windy night, I thought I heard multiple voices rising from her window, layered like a chorus. I told myself it was wind pushing through cracks in the boards, but deep down, I knew it was more. And I knew she wasn't alone. By March, the dress was unrecognizable. It no longer looked like something sewn by hands. The buttons shifted, misaligned, running in crooked patterns. The lace thickened in places, thinned to translucence in others, like skin grown uneven. When she walked, the hem didn't just drag, it writhed, curling in slow, deliberate motions, leaving faint streaks on the pavement. I saw it once by the street lamp. The dress moved before her legs did, pulling her forward like a leash. She didn't resist. She followed, obedient, eyes half shut like in prayer. The neighbors began calling it cursed. Some said it was Aiden holding her there, refusing to let go. Others whispered that she'd made a pact, that she'd promised him eternity, and this was her keeping it. No one visited the house anymore. Even I swore I'd stop looking. But at night, I couldn't help myself. I found my eyes pulled to her window, waiting for movement, dreading it. And every time I looked away, I felt something tugging at the edge of my vision, like the dress wanted me to watch. One night in early April, the knocking started again. Not at her house, but at mine. Soft at first, then louder, deliberate, coming from my closet door. I froze in bed, every muscle locked. The knocking paused, then resumed, 3 slow beats. When I finally found the courage to yank the door open, nothing waited, just clothes, hangers, boxes. When I stood there, trembling, I noticed a scrap of lace lying at the bottom. I reached down. It was damp, smelling faintly of earth. When I looked up again, Pauline was standing across the street in her window, watching me. She lifted her hands slowly, as if waving. I dropped the lace and slammed the door. I wanted to leave then, pack a bag, disappear, never look back. But every time I thought of it, something inside me froze. Because part of me knew leaving wouldn't matter. The dress wasn't confined to her house anymore. It was spreading, thread by thread, seam by seam, across everything around it, including me. And if I ran, it would only follow.
By April, the house across the street didn't look like a house anymore. The blinds never opened, the porch sagged under months of snowmelt, and even the paint seemed to peel faster than the other homes on the block. At night, it was worse. A dim glow leaking from her upstairs window, pale and steady, like a lantern hung to guide the lost. But the glow wasn't warm, wasn't yellow or amber like lamps. It was the kind of white that reminded you of morgues and fluorescent rooms where no one breathes easily. And always, always, behind that window, You could see the faint blur of her dress. Neighbors stopped walking the block altogether. Delivery drivers left packages 2 houses down, refusing to step closer. A for sale sign went up across the street, then another. Families moved out, quietly, without farewells. People whispered about the curse, about how the dress had soaked up something from the accident that refused to leave. I told myself I didn't believe in curses, but every night I found myself awake, staring at that glow, waiting for movement. Sometimes it came. A ripple, a shift, the unmistakable figure of Pollen moving through the room as if tethered by strings. One night, I swore I saw Aiden standing with her. Not whole, not solid, more like the impression of him, blurred and gray, his head bent low as if whispering. She tilted toward him, her hands folded, and I felt a sickness climb into my stomach, because she looked happy, happier than I had ever seen her alive. And when she turned her face toward me, across the distance, her smile widened until it seemed to split. I shut my blinds, but even then I swore I could feel that smile pressing through the glass. I tried to leave, packed a bag, booked a motel 2 towns away, drove halfway there before I realized I had left the lights on in my bedroom closet. It sounds insane, but I couldn't stand the thought of that door standing open while I was gone. I turned the car around. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, it was nearly dawn. The glow was still in her window. I unpacked without thinking, too ashamed to explain to myself why. The dreams worsened. I saw the dress everywhere. In mirrors, in shop windows, in the folds of curtains. Sometimes in dreams, it hung empty, swaying like something had just stepped out. Other times, it crawled along the floor, lace twisting like tendrils, the buttons clicking like teeth. Always, Pollen followed, her face pale, her lips whispering vows I couldn't make out. When I woke, the whisper remained, as if she'd spoken them into my ears instead of the dream. The worst came in May. I woke one night to the sound of fabric dragging across wood. At first I thought it was outside, wind catching a tarp, but then it grew louder, closer, until it was at my door. I froze, every muscle locked. The dragging stopped. Silence. Then 3 soft knocks, not at the front door, at the closet. I sat upright, shaking. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A message. From her. I hadn't heard that sound in weeks, not since I'd muted every notification. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The message read, "It's time."
I don't know why I opened the closet. Maybe because I couldn't bear the silence pressing against the door, or maybe because part of me already knew there was no escape. The door creaked open. Inside, my clothes hung limp, but behind them, the wall was wrong. The paint had peeled into long vertical strips, threads dangling like lace, and in the center was a shape, pale and rippling, fabric unfolding from nothing. A piece of the dress. I stumbled back, slammed the door shut, pressed my weight against it until dawn. When the sun rose, the closet looked ordinary again, but the air reeked faintly of earth, damp and metallic. From then on, I stopped fighting. I couldn't. The dress was spreading, pulling me in stitch by stitch. I saw scraps of lace appear on my chair, on the floor by my bed, even tangled in the branches of the tree outside my window. Every time I touched one, it dissolved, but the smell remained. I grew thinner, sleepless, consumed by the weight of something I couldn't name. In June, her parents disappeared. No ambulance, no moving truck. One day they were there, worn down and hollow-eyed. The next their house was empty, except for her. I don't think anyone asked where they went. No one wanted to. The only proof they'd ever lived there were the boards nailed across the downstairs windows, but even those looked brittle, as if eaten from the inside. And still, every night, the glow burned upstairs.
I knew I'd have to go inside. It wasn't bravery, more like inevitability, like a magnet pulling metal. I crossed the street one evening, the pavement still warm from the sun. Her front door stood ajar. No one had touched it, I'm sure of that. But it was open, waiting. The smell hit me first. Damp fabric, mildew, something sour beneath. The air was heavy, thick with dust that wasn't dust at all, but tiny threads drifting like cobwebs. The living room was bare, furniture gone, carpets stripped, only scraps of lace on the floor, scattered like petals after a ceremony. I climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, though I swear I wasn't heavier than usual. At the top, her door was open too. Inside, she stood with her back to me. The dress pooled around her in impossible folds, spreading across the floor like water. She didn't turn when I whispered her name. The lace rippled, though the air was still. And then I saw it. Her body was smaller than the dress now, her frame thin, fragile, almost translucent. The dress wasn't on her. It was holding her. Her skin sagged against the seams, her face pale, lips pressed into a smile too steady to be natural. When she finally turned, I realized her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were hollow, buttons stitched into sockets, gleaming faintly in the pale light.
She lifted her hand. Lace stretched from her wrist to the floor, anchoring her in place. Her mouth moved, and, though no sound left her lips, I heard her voice inside my skull. "You came." The floor shifted beneath me. The dress spread, threads curling around my ankles, pulling me forward. I fought, but the harder I pulled, the tighter it held. She tilted her head, eyes fixed on me, and whispered again inside my skull. "You don't have to fight. We made a vow. You'll wear it too." I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was sinking into fabric, the next I was outside, gasping on the street, dawn breaking behind the houses. My legs were scratched, bleeding in places where threads had cut deep. My hands smelled of damp cloth. Across the street, her window glowed faintly, and in the reflection of my own window later that night, I thought I saw it, a line of small buttons running down my back, faint but there, pressing against the fabric of my shirt. Since then, I don't trust mirrors. I don't trust sleep. The dress isn't just hers anymore. It's moving, reaching, stitching itself into others, into me, maybe into you now that you've heard this. I don't know if Poland is alive inside it, or if she died the day of the crash and what remains is only cloth and vow. But I know this: vows don't die when people do. They wait, they bind, and some promises are hungrier than grief. If you ever see a girl in a wedding dress that looks too old, too heavy, don't look at the buttons. Don't let her speak your name. And for God's sake, don't answer when the closet knocks. Because once you do, you're already wearing it.